Hi, I'm Chris Sullivan, and I want to describe for you the theory of change that we created in 2012 that describes how domestic violence programs promote survivors' social and emotional well-being. So the development of a theory of change was actually driven by the fact that more and more funders were asking how the different services being provided by domestic violence programs were expected to make a difference in survivors' lives. As funds were becoming more scarce, funders were wanting to know which services they should fund, which were more promising. So they were asking what our theory of change was. In other words, why did we do what we did? And how exactly did we expect those activities to result in positive changes for survivors and their children? Now, I'd been working for over 20 years at that time with domestic violence programs, helping them develop models of program evaluation that would not only satisfy funders, but that would be useful to them and their programs and that would be easy to do with no money. So I had already been doing a lot of thinking about this and discussing this with programs and with survivors, but we hadn't yet written anything down. So in 2012, we did. So this was a very collaborative process. The creation of this theory of change involved a lot of people. We created a project advisory group of the culturally specific national resource centers, the topic-specific national resource centers, survivors, researchers, funders, state coalitions, FIPSA and STOP state administrators, and local domestic violence programs, because we really wanted to take our time and make sure that we created a theory of change that would be widely accepted and useful to the folks on the ground doing this work. So let me just talk with you briefly about what is a theory of change, for those of you who aren't that familiar with the term. It's very much like a logic model, and I know some of you are groaning right now because of how much you dislike logic models, but this is an improvement, in my opinion, over logic models. I always had a problem with logic models making things too complicated. You don't have to understand what an input is or an output is or the difference between goals and objectives, and they sometimes have made it too complicated. A theory of change is similar to a logic model, but it's based a little bit more on empirical evidence and thinking through why is it we do what we do to lead to the change that we're looking for. So you start at the end. You start thinking at the very end, what's the long-term outcome or change that we want to achieve? What's that goal? And then we look to the empirical evidence to say, well, what is it we know will lead to that goal? So we're not just making it up as we go. We look to the evidence to say, what is it that will lead to this change? And then we design programs and activities that will lead to the factors that impact the long-term change. And that's where this is very similar to a logic model. Okay, so we have to start with what's the desired long-term change? Well, as I mentioned, I had been working with programs for many years on program evaluation. So one of the first things I would ask them is, what is it you're hoping to do? What's the long-term change? And most interestingly, answered with a variation of, our long-term change is to end domestic violence. And I wonder how many of you would say that as well. Okay, if I were to say to you, what's the long-term objective of your program? What is it that you in your program want to do? Many of you would say, we want to end domestic violence. Wrong answer. I know that seems counterintuitive. I know that seems very strange to you, but that is not the outcome of domestic violence programs working with survivors and their children. That is the outcome that we all want to do as a movement. Okay, that's why we do what we do in collaboration with state coalitions, with community, with other systems, with batter intervention programs, with healthcare systems, okay, together with all of the national resource centers that we have. We've got the national groups, the state groups, the community level and local groups. Together, our desired long-term change obviously is to end domestic violence. But part of the problem when we have talked to funders or community members and said, our mission is to end domestic violence, and yet at the same time, we're saying we work with survivors and survivors aren't responsible for the violence that's happening. You can see why funders have been confused, and we have to take some responsibility for not really being clear about our mission. Matter of fact, many of your mission statements, I can guarantee, say that your mission is to end domestic violence. And again, together, that's our mission. But local programs focused on survivors and their children have a different but very, very important outcome. And that's what we need to be clear to our communities about. So, while the ultimate goal of our collective work is to end domestic violence, the ultimate goal of programs for survivors is to promote their well-being over time. So think about that. Think about that in relation to your program. It goes back to being able to explain to other people why we do what we do and why what we do is important. Because if we say it's about ending domestic violence, then the funders are going to say, well, then why aren't we funding the batter intervention programs? And while I think they should be funding programs dealing with perpetrators, what we do, what local programs do, is equally important. It's incredibly important. But let's think about why we do what we do. So what do you hope to accomplish by offering all of the different programs that you offer? Advocacy, counseling, support groups, immediate safety, safety planning, all of the other services that you do. What is it that you hope they achieve? Okay? And we often say safety, and safety is important. But think about if a client leaves your program and then you hear from her in 6 months and she says, I've been physically safe. I've been absolutely safe because I do exactly what he wants. I never leave the house. I make sure I don't get him angry. I make sure the kids don't get him angry. I have no life, but I'm physically safe. Now, none of us would say that's a good outcome. So it's really not just about safety for us. It's about promoting well-being. We want survivors and their kids to be well. We want them to feel empowered. We want them to have a high quality of life. Isn't that really what it is that we're trying to accomplish? Is that high quality of life? So that's where we need to start with our long-term outcome. So, if the desired long-term change is social and emotional well-being of survivors and their children, and I want to just stop here and say the social part is important. And we talked a lot about this in that collaborative Creating This Theory of Change, that we don't want this to all just be about mental health. This is not about psychological well-being, emotional well-being only. It's about social well-being, which is people having access to the resources that they need, having the money that they need, having the housing that they need. Okay, that this is not just about changing what's going on inside of people, but it's making sure that they have the resources they need from their communities to be well. So, what I had to do next is, once we said, okay, the long-term outcome is social and emotional well-being, well, what is well-being? How would we actually, operationalize that? What predicts people saying they have high quality of life? So that's when I turned to the literature, and I got outside of the domestic violence literature, and I just looked at all of the literature anywhere that dealt with what leads to people saying that they have high quality of life. And there's a lot of empirical evidence for both intrapersonal factors and interpersonal factors. Intrapersonal factors are those things that go on inside of ourselves, inside of us, okay? And what are the two biggest predictors of people saying that they are well, that they have high quality of life, is high self-efficacy and hope. Self-efficacy is when you believe that you have the knowledge, skills, and ability and resources to make the changes in your life that need to be made. Now, doesn't that sound like something that domestic violence programs help survivors do? And the other really critical intrapersonal factor is feeling hopeful. And I had been hearing for years from DV programs and from survivors that an immediate outcome of a lot of our services was survivors feeling more hopeful. So those are the important intrapersonal factors, but there's also interpersonal and social factors, and that goes back to that social well-being. And there's a lot of empirical evidence for social connectedness and positive relationships being related to people saying they have high quality of life. Safety, obviously, if you're not safe, you're not going to feel like you have quality of life. Health, and not just physical health, but emotional health and spiritual health. Possessing adequate resources, that goes back to, are you housed? Can you clothe your children? Can you eat? Can you actually afford to do the things in your life that relieve the stress of poverty? And then also, and I had to go into the literature outside of the United States often to get at this, but the social, political, and economic equity. People who are well are more likely to feel like they're empowered, that they have power within their communities, their neighborhoods, political power, social power, and since programs are focused on empowerment, I thought it made a lot of sense to bring this in as well. So, what are additional predictors of children's well-being? Well, everything I just mentioned are also predictors of children's well-being, but in addition, there are a few others, and these have all also been negatively impacted by intimate partner violence. The first is what predicts children's well-being? Having a secure attachment to the non-abusive parent. And I think we can't emphasize that enough, especially when so many mothers are under siege for being held responsible for the abuse that the perpetrators have inflicted on them and their children. So when you have people wanting to take the children away from the non-abusive mother, we need to really be arguing that there's a lot of empirical evidence that children's well-being is very, very connected to having that secure attachment to the non-abusive parent. In addition, children having a positive self-concept, feeling like they're good people, having strong social and relational competencies, that being able to play well with others. And these are all things that I would say domestic violence programs work on with children. Okay, so all of this, I think, is making a lot of sense and relates very well to what our programs have been focusing on. So now, returning to our theory of change, if the desired long-term outcome is social and emotional well-being, we've now defined the desired long-term outcome, we've identified the factors that are known, that are empirically shown to lead to those outcomes. Okay, so let me go through those again with you. At the intrapersonal level, you've got self-efficacy and hope, and interpersonal and social factors, social connectedness, positive relationships, safety, health, having resources, social, political, and economic equity. I'm hoping that as you're seeing this and hearing about this, you're recognizing that these are all things you and your programs are trying to have a positive impact on. Then we need to make sure that our programs and activities are designed to lead to those factors that impact the long-term change. So, similar to what you would see in a logic model, the activity leads to the short-term outcome that's expected to lead to the long-term change. So, I want to show this to you in a figure form, and this is on the DV Evidence Project website. There's also like a 35-page document that goes into all of this in more detail, but we're trying to just save you time. We know how busy you all are. But there is a figure, if this is useful to you in your writing grants or explaining your theory of change to other people, please feel free to use this. But we thought that this might be an easier way to describe this all relatively quickly. So here's our long-term outcome, social and emotional well-being. Okay, so we put that at the end, and then we say, what are the intrapersonal and interpersonal components of well-being? And as we discussed, there's a lot of evidence that self-efficacy and hopefulness are important to social and emotional well-being. And then let's not forget the interpersonal and social components of well-being, because local programs really focus on these as well. Social connectedness, safety, adequate economic and social opportunities, economic stability, justice, and good health. So this is what we're trying to achieve long term, but this is where research comes in. We need more research that focuses on the extent to which our programs lead to these. This is not what we have to expect local programs to do. I know that all of you are expected to now do more and more evaluation of your programs, and I have yet to talk to anybody who's getting money to do that. They're just getting those expectations with no extra money. So we need to figure out what are the measurable outcomes then that programs could look at that are more reasonable, that are short-term, that we know from research leads to those long-term objectives. Okay. So, intrapersonal changes, what we know will lead to self-efficacy and hopefulness, increased knowledge about domestic violence, about rights, about opportunities, okay, but also increased skills. Self-efficacy is not just about knowing what you can do, it's having the skills to do it. And many of you help survivors increase their skills. Okay. Having less distress, having a stronger sense of self, and having better, more positive coping skills. These are all things that have been linked to self-efficacy and hopefulness, and they're all outcomes that you can measure fairly easily. So what about interpersonal and social changes? Well, I would say the interpersonal and social changes that are easier to measure are increased access to community resources, and that could mean getting the housing that the person wants, being able to go back to school, getting food, any of those types of community resources. Strengthening that mother-child bond that we know many abusers intentionally try to break. Having more support and community connections. And then thinking about the systems change work that you do, having those responsive system responses are changes that we hope to have more immediately that then will lead to those longer-term outcomes. So now we have to look at the program activities. And when I first started doing this, I was thinking about looking at shelter and advocacy and support groups and counseling and transitional housing and those different sort of more formalized programs, and realized that a lot of the activities that go on within these programs overlap. So I moved away from coming up with the programs themselves because, one, we don't want to limit our ability to expand our programming and do things differently. And I really focused more on what is it we actually do? What are the actual activities? So what I came up with here is, and again, this is not just my thinking. This is from working for many years with people doing this work and asking them, what is it you do? Okay? Whether it's through shelter, advocacy, support groups, whatever, what are the important things you do? And what comes up over and over is the important information that you provide to people. Think about how many survivors need some education or information about their legal rights, or why domestic violence happens and what's the impact on their children. Why are they experiencing the kind of trauma responses that they're experiencing? And also sociopolitical issues around racism and sexism and classism and homophobia. You provide survivors and their children with an incredible amount of really, really useful information. You also safety plan, and I hear this regardless of whether folks work short-term with survivors or long-term with survivors. You're safety planning frequently and over time. You're helping build skills. Now again, with all of these activities, they're individualized to each survivor. Some survivors come into your programs, they know more about the resources in the community than we do, right? Some don't need any education about domestic violence. They've got that all down. So I'm not suggesting we do all of these activities with everybody. We individualize our services, and that's a strength of domestic violence programs. But for some folks, they have different skills that need to be built or enhanced, just like we all do. It might be new coping skills. It might be parenting skills. It might be writing a resume. It could be any kinds of skills that you may help somebody to attain. All of the services that you provide are offered with a lot of empathy and encouragement and respect. And that's not just a nice thing. That has been shown to lead to self-efficacy and hopefulness. That encouragement, that letting somebody believe in themselves, saying that you believe in them, is incredibly important to moving towards self-efficacy. Fifth is supportive counseling. Now, we could call this a lot of different things, and that could be therapy, it could be counseling, it could just be the supportive peer counseling that happens in a lot of our interactions. But that is something that a lot of programs are doing in a lot of different ways. Now, advocacy. At first I just used the word advocacy, but then I realized we need to get clear about what advocacy is and what it isn't, because I think we're sometimes using it to mean just about anything we do. Okay? And it isn't. It's something very specific. So in number 6 here, I call advocacy an activity designed to increase access to community resources and opportunities. So it's not just saying, here's where the prosecutor is, here's where the hospital is, here's where the welfare office is. That's providing information, and that's important. But helping increase access to community resources and opportunities is actively engaging with someone to mobilize or generate resources. So it's going out and helping obtain that housing, convincing that landlord to give this person a chance, even though they may not have the full security deposit, encouraging the prosecutor to prosecute when they don't think there's enough evidence, but the survivor really wants this to happen. Okay, so it's actually advocating on behalf of and with the survivor to get those resources and opportunities. And that's a critical activity in a lot of programs. Number 7, you'll notice that I keep talking about this evidence of the importance of increased community bonding, social support, having strong family, friends, communities. So that means our activities need to be about increasing that social support and those community connections. And in my experience around the country, this is probably the one place I see a lot of programs falling short more than in other places. And I'm not saying every program, but I'm thinking especially of a number of more traditional, old school shelter programs that actually do the opposite of increasing social support and social connections. And I think we need to look at that. So when programs say you have to cut off ties to your community in order to use our services, people can't know you're here, you can't call them, you can't talk to them, you have to quit your job and move to this shelter outside of your community. we're actually doing the exact opposite of what we know will lead to social and emotional well-being. So what can our programs do more of? And some are doing an outstanding job, by the way. Some do work with survivors, families, and friends and communities. Some are really focused on enhancing social support and community connections. But this is an area I think we all need to really be looking at. And then finally, we don't want to disregard or minimize the importance of the community and systems change work that you do. And this came up a lot as we were talking about creating this model, is it's not just about the individual work being done with survivors. A lot of what programs are doing that is helping lead to more safety and well-being and reduced domestic violence is the community and systems change work. So we wanted to bring that in, but we were also a little bit wary because we don't want funders to then say, oh, okay, so how are you going to measure that you're actually creating that change, even though we're not giving you any money to do that? So what we did around that is we did want to bring it in because it's incredibly important. But this is why we put this green frame around the whole model. And we say in here that around this entire model, all of this work is done in collaboration with others. So we are not just siloed doing all of this ourselves and responsible for these outcomes to be achieved just on our own. But this work is done with collaboration with community partners and is impacted by community context. It's hard to help somebody get into housing when there's no housing available in your community. It's hard to keep someone safe if the justice system is not doing its job. So we want to make sure that even though we are saying this is what programs do, and this is how they expect this change to occur, it is all dependent on or interrelated with what's happening elsewhere in our communities. I hope this was helpful to you. This and more information is available on the dvevidenceproject.org website, which I encourage you to check out. Finally, before I go, I want to talk just briefly about the evidence that exists that domestic violence programs do result in positive outcomes for survivors and their kids. I know a lot of people are afraid that what they're doing is not evidence-based. And so I have great news. There is actually evidence behind your services that what you're doing is making a difference. We have brief, and these are all 10 pages or less, evidence reviews on the DV Evidence Project website. But for those of you who just want a quick overview, who want to see very quickly what is the evidence and how does it map onto our theory of change, we have created this other brief video, and I hope you'll find it helpful to you. Thanks very much for your time and attention.